Part 1. Jesus, the one who brought love to the world. Have you ever wondered what it would be like if someone came to teach humanity about love, kindness, and forgiveness? More than 2,000 years ago, in a small land called Israel, such a man walked the earth, Jesus Christ. But he was not just an ordinary man. He was the Son of God, sent to the world not to seize power or rule, but to bring hope, love, and salvation to humanity. From a young age, Jesus displayed extraordinary wisdom and understanding of God. At just 12 years old, he debated with priests and scholars in the temple, leaving them amazed at his knowledge. Yet, instead of choosing a life of glory or wealth, he chose humility, living among ordinary people, working as a carpenter, and patiently waiting for the time to fulfill his mission. At the age of 30, Jesus began his ministry, calling people to repentance and faith in the good news. He did not only preach with words, but also demonstrated God's power through miracles. He healed the sick, gave sight to the blind, made the lame walk, and even raised the dead. But the greatest miracle was not in these acts. It was in the message of love and forgiveness he carried. He taught, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Forgive others, for you too have been forgiven. Live with kindness, for God does not measure people by wealth or power, but by the heart." One of the most touching stories of Jesus' love was when a woman caught in adultery was brought before him. According to Jewish law at the time, she was to be stoned to death. The angry crowd gathered around, waiting for Jesus' judgment. But instead of condemning her, he calmly looked at them and said, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." One by one, the accusers dropped their stones and walked away, realizing that none of them were without sin. When only the woman remained, Jesus looked at her with love and said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go now and sin no more." But not everyone embraced his message of love. The religious leaders feared Jesus' growing influence. They could not accept that a humble carpenter could teach with such authority. They began to conspire against him, seeking ways to discredit him before the crowds. Jesus knew this. He knew that opposition was rising. He knew that ahead of him lay suffering and loss. Yet he continued to teach, to love, and to forgive. Because he did not come to be exalted, he came to give love even when it meant enduring pain. And then the fateful moment arrived. Part 2. The Last Supper, a prophecy of sacrifice. Time was running out. Jesus knew that his enemies were ready to act. The footsteps of betrayal were drawing near, and in just a few hours he would face his greatest suffering. But before everything unfolded, he had something important to do. One final meal with his closest disciples. That evening, Jesus and his disciples gathered around a long table. This was no ordinary meal. It was the Last Supper, the final gathering before his suffering. The atmosphere in the room was different, heavy with an unspoken tension, as if everyone could sense that something profound was about to take place. Jesus took a loaf of bread, broke it, and handed it to his disciples. His voice was warm yet filled with deep emotion. "Take and eat. This is my body, which will be given for you." Then he took a cup of wine, gave it to them, and said, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood, the blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for the forgiveness of sins." The disciples fell silent. They did not fully understand his words, but they felt the sacredness of the moment. Jesus was speaking of sacrifice, a sacrifice that would change the world. Then, in the solemn stillness, he spoke words that shook them all. "One of you will betray me." All eyes widened in shock as the disciples looked around anxiously. Murmurs filled the room, and some, with fear in their voices, asked, "Lord, is it I?" Jesus turned his gaze toward Judas, one of his 12 closest disciples. His eyes were kind yet full of understanding. Then he spoke, "What you are about to do, do quickly." Judas froze. He knew that the master had seen through everything, but his heart was set. Without another word, he stood up and hurried out into the night. As Judas disappeared into the darkness, Jesus turned back to the remaining disciples and spoke his final words before his arrest. "I give you a new commandment. Love one another as I have loved you." Then he comforted them, saying, "You will grieve, but your sorrow will turn into joy. Take heart, for I have overcome the world." The disciples listened in silence, but their hearts were filled with unease. They could not fathom that in just a few hours, the teacher they cherished would be taken from them. After the supper, Jesus and his disciples left the room and made their way toward the Garden of Gethsemane. Outside, the night loomed dark and still. But this was no ordinary night. This was the night of destiny. Jesus knew that the hour of his trial had come. Part 3. Betrayal and Arrest, the Darkest Hour. It was late at night. The Garden of Gethsemane lay in silence, the only sound being the whispering wind through the olive trees. Jesus and his disciples had come here after the Last Supper, but he did not come to rest. He came to pray. Jesus knew what was about to happen. He knelt down, his eyes closed, and his voice was filled with urgency. "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." He prayed in deep agony. His sweat fell like drops of blood. He could feel the immense suffering that awaited him, not only the physical torment, but the weight of carrying the sins of all humanity. Meanwhile, his disciples, the ones he loved most, had fallen asleep. He returned and found them dozing. His voice was gentle, yet filled with sorrow. "Could you not keep watch with me for 1 hour? Stay awake and pray, so that you will not fall into temptation." But they did not fully grasp the gravity of this moment. Then, in the stillness of the night, a sound broke through, the echo of approaching footsteps. A group of Roman soldiers, carrying blazing torches and armed with weapons, entered the garden. Leading them was Judas. Judas stepped forward. He knew this was the moment to carry out what had been arranged, the betrayal that had been sold for 30 pieces of silver. He looked at Jesus, then slowly placed a kiss on his cheek. Judas spoke. Jesus looked at him, his eyes filled with kindness but also sorrow. "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" Immediately, the soldiers rushed forward, seizing Jesus. The disciples were in shock. Peter, overcome with rage, drew his sword and struck a soldier, cutting off his ear. But Jesus raised his hand to stop him. "Put your sword away. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword." Then he reached out and touched the wounded soldier. Instantly, the man's ear was healed. Yet, the ones who came to arrest him paid no attention to the miracle. They bound him in chains and dragged him away into the night. The disciples were terrified. Panic overtook them, and they fled, leaving their teacher alone to face his fate. Jesus did not resist. He did not cry out. He knew this was the path he must walk, the path that would bring salvation to the world. Tonight, darkness had fallen over everything, but the light was not gone yet. Part 4. The Unjust Trial, the Judgment of Man. Jesus was bound and dragged through the night, brought before the chief priests and religious leaders. They had long awaited this moment. This was not a fair trial. This was a carefully orchestrated trap to eliminate him. Before the council, the accusers stepped forward. They hurled false accusations. "He calls himself the Son of God. He defies our laws. He claims he will destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days." But Jesus remained silent. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. His silence enraged the high priest, Caiaphas. Stepping forward, he demanded loudly, "Are you the Christ, the Son of God?" Jesus answered calmly, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of God and coming on the clouds of heaven." At these words, Caiaphas tore his robes in fury and turned to the council, shouting, "What more proof do we need? He has spoken blasphemy. He is worthy of death." At once, the crowd turned against him. They began to mock him, to strike him. Some slapped his face, while others blindfolded him, laughing as they struck him and taunted, "If you are a prophet, tell us who just hit you." But the religious council did not have the authority to sentence him to death. For that, they needed to bring Jesus before the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, the man who would decide his fate. Before Pontius Pilate, Jesus stood, unafraid, offering no defense for himself. Pilate looked at him, a man who bore no resemblance to a dangerous criminal, and asked, "Are you truly the king of the Jews?" Jesus replied, "My kingdom is not of this world." Pilate saw no guilt in him. He knew that the chief priests had handed Jesus over out of envy. Wanting to release him, Pilate sought a way to spare his life. But outside, the crowd had already been stirred into a frenzy. Their voices roared, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate hesitated. He did not want to execute an innocent man. So he devised a plan. Every year, during the Passover festival, he was permitted to release one prisoner of the people's choosing. At that moment, another prisoner was in captivity, a violent criminal named Barabbas. Pilate ordered both Jesus and Barabbas to be brought before the crowd, then asked them, "Whom do you want me to release to you?" The mob screamed, "Release Barabbas! Kill Jesus!" Pilate was astonished. He asked again, "But why? What crime has this man committed?" The crowd did not care. They only shouted louder, "Crucify him!" Under the overwhelming pressure of the people, Pilate sighed in resignation. He called for a basin of water, washed his hands before them, and declared, "I am innocent of this man's blood. Do as you wish." And so Jesus was handed over to those who would carry out his execution. The verdict had been given. But this was not the judgment of God. This was the judgment of man. Jesus' enemies believed they had won. But they did not know that this very moment was part of the greatest plan of all. Part 5. The Cross, the greatest sacrifice. After being sentenced to death, Jesus was handed over to the Roman soldiers. But his suffering was far from over. It had only just begun. The soldiers began to torment him. They beat him, mocked him, and humiliated him. They stripped him of his garments and lashed his body with whips embedded with sharp hooks, tearing his flesh open, causing blood to flow from every wound. Each strike was not just physical pain, it was the weight of human scorn upon the Savior of the world. Then they placed a crown of thorns upon his head. The sharp thorns pierced into his skin and blood trickled down his face. Draping a scarlet robe over him, they knelt before him in mockery, sneering, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Yet he did not resist. He did not fight back. Afterward, they forced him to carry his own cross, a heavy wooden beam upon which he would soon be crucified. The journey to Golgotha was not far, but for a man weakened by torture, it was unbearable. He staggered under the weight, his breaths growing shallow until he could no longer go on. A man named Simon of Cyrene was seized and compelled to carry the cross for him. And so they reached the place of execution. The Roman soldiers stripped him once more and laid him upon the cross. Long, sharp nails were driven through his hands and feet. The hammer rang out, each strike sending waves of searing pain through his body. Each blow met with the jeering of the crowd. Yet he remained silent, uttering no cry of protest. The cross was lifted, standing tall against the sky. Jesus was crucified between two thieves, one on his right, the other on his left. Beneath the cross, the crowd mocked him. "If you are the Son of God, save yourself. Come down from the cross." But Jesus did not respond. Instead, he prayed, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." One of the criminals crucified beside him also sneered, "If you are truly the Christ, save yourself and us too." But the other thief rebuked him, "We are receiving what we deserve, for we are guilty, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he turned to Jesus, his voice trembling. "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus looked at him, a faint smile on his lips, and replied, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Time passed. The sky suddenly darkened. Though it was still midday, it was as if all of creation was mourning. At the 9th hour, Jesus lifted his eyes to heaven. His voice rang out one last time, "It is finished. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." Then he breathed his last. At that very moment, the earth trembled. Rocks split apart. In the temple, the great curtain separating man from God was torn in two, a sign that his sacrifice had opened a new way for humanity. A Roman centurion, witnessing everything, stood in awe and declared, "Truly, this was the Son of God." Jesus' enemies believed they had won. They thought his death was the end of everything. But they did not know that this was only the beginning. Part 6. The Resurrection, the greatest miracle. Jesus was dead. His disciples were in despair. They had placed all their faith in him, but now he was gone. All they saw was his lifeless body being taken down from the cross. A man named Joseph of Arimathea, a secret follower of Jesus, requested permission from Pilate to take his body for burial. He wrapped Jesus in a clean linen cloth and laid him in a tomb carved out of rock. A massive stone was rolled across the entrance, sealing the grave. The chief priests, fearing that his disciples might steal the body and claim he had risen, asked the Roman governor to secure the tomb. Pilate granted their request, and Roman soldiers were stationed to guard it. 3 days passed. Early in the morning on the third day, while it was still dark, a group of women, including Mary Magdalene, came to the tomb to anoint Jesus' body with spices. But when they arrived, they were astonished. The great stone had been rolled away. They rushed forward and, looking inside, found the tomb empty. Jesus was not there. Suddenly an angel appeared, radiant like lightning. The women trembled with fear, but the angel reassured them. "Do not be afraid. You are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He has risen, just as he said. Come, see the place where he lay, and go quickly to tell his disciples." Filled with both awe and overwhelming joy, the women hurried to spread the news. As they ran, suddenly Jesus himself appeared before them. He stood there, alive, no longer a lifeless body, but the risen Lord, full of life and glory. Overcome with joy, the women fell to their knees, clinging to his feet and weeping with gratitude. Jesus looked at them and said, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my disciples that I have risen, and I will meet them in Galilee." The news spread quickly. At first, the disciples were skeptical, but then Jesus appeared to them. He ate with them, spoke with them, and showed them the scars on his hands and feet. But one disciple refused to believe, Thomas. He declared, "Unless I see the marks of the nails in his hands and put my finger into his wounds, I will not believe." A week later, Jesus appeared again among the disciples. Turning to Thomas, he said, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Stop doubting and believe." Overcome with emotion, Thomas fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face, and exclaimed, "My Lord and my God!" Jesus looked at him and said, "Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. But blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." He continued to appear to hundreds of people, proving that he had truly conquered death. Before ascending to heaven, he gave his disciples a mission. Go into all the world and preach the good news to all nations. Teach them to obey everything I have commanded you, and surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. Then, before their very eyes, Jesus was lifted up into the sky. A cloud enveloped him, and he disappeared from their sight. But he was never truly gone. His promise still echoes through the generations. "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will live, even though they die." This story is not just history. It continues to this day. Easter is more than just a holiday. It is hope. It is a reminder that nothing is ever truly lost. Jesus has conquered death, and because of that, our hope is eternal. He is risen. And that is the story of Easter. Not just a historical event, but a powerful reminder for each of us. Jesus suffered, was betrayed, was crucified, but he triumphed over it all. He rose again, opening a new path for humanity, a path of love, forgiveness, and unwavering hope. Easter is more than just a day of remembrance. It is an invitation to believe, even when everything seems hopeless. An invitation to love, even when we have been hurt. An invitation to forgive, even when it feels impossible. And what about you? Do you believe in the miracle of Easter? Do you believe that love is stronger than death and that light will always overcome darkness? Let this story not just be something we hear, but something that lives in our hearts every single day. He is risen. And because of that, our hope is eternal. If this story has touched you, share it with those around you. And never forget, the love and forgiveness that Jesus brought to the world are still with us, here and now. Wishing you a blessed and peaceful Easter.